Okay, so hello everyone. I am so thankful and so joy for this moment that we are about to have. This is the first ever for all of us virtual roundtable, and we will be speaking on the topic of sexual assault awareness. I am Bianca Whitaker, licensed professional counselor associate and owner of Whitaker Counseling and Consulting, and this roundtable is presented on behalf of the business. My mission for the business is to educate, normalize, and empower. And I'm hoping more than anything that this roundtable will do for the topic of sexual assault awareness. And so I have some people joining me. So I will allow them now to state their name and just introduce themselves however they choose.
Okay. Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Dorian Martinez. I am a mental health case manager working on becoming LPC associate and eventually becoming a licensed professional counselor. I've been working in mental health for the past 6 years, and I represent Houston, and I grew up in Houston. So yeah, that's pretty much a little summary of myself.
Okay, I'm Valerie Gonzalez. I'm a licensed master social worker. I've been in social work for about 10 years. Currently, my role is mental health services on a college campus.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chester Jefferson. I'm a licensed professional counselor associate. I'm currently working practicing at Kimberly Boyd Counseling Center, which is located in. We have 4 locations across Cleveland, Houston, Taft City, and Kingwood. And here to lend my voice as possible as I can, as best I can.
Okay, thank you guys. So before we actually begin our rounds, there will be 5 rounds and a closure. And so feel free to reference your notes or, just kind of just be present in the conversation if anything else comes up outside of your notes or what you initially planned. But I do want to preface this before we begin with the fact that I purposely and intentionally, well, they're the same. I intentionally chose to have a culturally and ethnically diverse panel for this. A lot of our studies in schools reflected that of heterosexual middle-aged white men. And when we look at this panel, none of us are that. So it's definitely creating and providing a space for a voice for those that look like us and those that resonate with us and those that identify with us in the intersections of our identities. And so I also want to preface that I myself am a victim of sexual assault. And so, yes, we are all mental health professionals on this call. However, I will also be speaking from the perspective of a victim. So the benefit to that is that I can kind of vet the information that's coming, or I can ask follow-up questions, or the panel can ask me questions as a victim so we can get further discussions or just engagement on this topic. So before we begin with round 1, was there anything that anyone wanted to share or put in this space before we begin? No.
Thank you for sharing the information, Bianca. I think it takes a lot of courage to be open to share that. So thank you. And the bravery is definitely seen.
Well, thank you for that. Shout out to vulnerability and healing and all the things. So yes, and I'm hope more than anything, again, it's not about me, less of me, more for them. It's so someone else can have a voice or someone else can say, oh, okay, this is okay. Because culturally there's differences when it comes to these topics.
Right.
So we're going to go ahead and get started. I will not lead the rounds. So I want to put that in the space. Since I'm facilitating, I will ask one of you to go first. Of course, I'm going to chime in, piggyback, state my piece, but I will not lead the rounds to create the opportunity for you all. So for round 1, we will be defining sexual assault. So this is talking about what sexual assault is and is not. And we don't need to have penal code definitions or dictionary definitions. It's just kind of going off of us as mental health professionals, what we see, what we experience, and just our understanding. So I will ask someone to lead us in that discussion.
Well, what I remember reading is it's basically sexual behavior without consent, explicit consent. So that can encompass like rape, incest. I know there was one more, but it's basically sexual behavior that's unwanted and definitely without explicit consent.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Anybody else ready to piggyback on that?
About that. Valerie had a good definition, and when I reflected on this question, looking it through, and I think the number one thing that stood out to me is it's non-consensual act uh, bestowed on the victim,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's a bigger term too that it falls under sexual violence. So I know for us, a lot of us are professionals that went through a major education. This is a concept that we've always heard, during our undergrad, graduate programs. And now that we're in the field helping those clients, I think it's important to always uh, be caught up with what's sexual assault, but also understanding the other umbrella terms that involve sexual violence, especially for us that come from different multicultural backgrounds, and understanding that, hey, the times have changed. So yeah, sexual assault is an important concept to learn, and also to teach and educate, not only ourselves, but people around us, because we're leaders in the community.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, just one intentionally sexually touches another person without their consent. And I can see that's our next concept too. But yeah, Chester, what did you have in your perspective about this?
Well, I just wanted to add one thing that I've learned in detail with clients that I've encountered is that it's always not the same term as legally sexual assault. So that it can be pretty broader than that versus, I know it was an illegal law being broken, but I was still sexually assaulted. So I think the consensual part is very, very big, but it's also a broader concept for when we say assault and sexual assault. So I want to add that to it as well.
For sure. So round 2 is going to be consult. And I feel like we all got something to say. I know I do. So Chester, you reel me back. But before moving on to Dorian's point, when I kind of took some notes on this, I actually looked at the penal code, right? Because we know culturally and in society what we view as assault. But I looked at the penal code, the Texas penal code, guys. We're all in Texas. And it talked about the use of physical force, violence, and coercion. And that really stood out to me. And it also talked about exploitation, where you do have, like you said, we're community leaders. So you do have the mental health professionals, you do have these doctors, you do have these other community leaders that are exploiting individuals. And on the topic of coercion, it mentioned if the victim believes that you can follow through with that threat. So sometimes, like when you hear it and it's like, people get manipulated or things like that, or he said that he would kill my family, or she said that she would tell my wife, right? Like if that person believes that, right, that's leading to assault, and that's a form of violence. I think sometimes we only think of violence as physical, but you can have verbal violence, you can have verbal aggression, you can have these different aspects of violence. But something that really stood out was the victim believing the threat, or believing that the perpetrator could follow through on whatever they said that they would do. And that's so important, especially when we think about young kids, or we think about vulnerable populations. Myself, I have a father who is paralyzed and suffers from aphasia. So that means that he can't speak, but he can understand what you're saying. And he's paralyzed, so he's not walking. You know what I mean? So if I think about the most vulnerable population, you are sometimes stuck to believe that whatever they say can be true, for sure.
Well, and that's very subjective too. So I think when you're thinking about law, to the perspective of I feel threatened, I could just see how if you didn't feel like that was a very credible threat, like if you heard other people and you're like, no, they're not going to believe me, so I'm not even going to say anything, right? So how can I really go to court, and how could I really explain to you how this person made me feel? I think that's hard, because that's like really subjective to say this person felt like they were threatened.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I wanted to touch into that with round 3 with the impact, right? Because just kind of how you said, what you just mentioned was like internalizing, or self-blame, like, no, never mind. Right? Like I've had this traumatic experience, but nobody's going to believe me. And, but yeah, I agree. That's very important. Did anybody else want to add anything else before we went to round 2?
I was going to say, I wanted to see what y'all thought about like digital social media. I mean, that's just, when people's like the coercion part or the threat, but
Yeah,
virtually, right? Like I
yeah,
wonder how that plays in.
yeah. And that's what I was thinking about the interesting part when you say coercion, because we often think about threats as like threaten my life with physical violence. But there's always the threat of like someone would do something sexual to someone in a threat. And how often do we people just blow by a physical threat? So I mean I can imagine how many sexual threats are thrown out there that don't be taken serious.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with digital, it leaves more of a footprint now. So hey, you said this to me, but we all know in our society who's waiting around to prosecute.
Mm-hmm.
Those threats normally go they and that's the footprint. They normally go empty as well. They normally don't follow up on those.
Mm-hmm.
The sexual exploitation. And when you
Yeah.
said more of a footprint, my mind immediately went to Snapchat, which was created to be able to send nudes without the footprint. You know,
Correct.
it's
Correct.
changed over time, but that was like the initial, the foundation of it. You know, and they had the technology for if anybody screenshots it after you send it, it will flag them. And so even thinking of that, of how technology is coming around to say, ooh, how can we not have that footprint? Or even in my work as a school counselor, I experience people doing sexual exploitation, you know, and they're not understanding like that's harassment, that's aggression, that's violence, like that's, you know, and the kids are just kind of like, oh well, and I'm like, no, if you posted that, you posted that, but for someone to turn around and say, ooh, I have this, so you need to, you know,
Correct. Yes.
ooh, that social media and this technology, it gets grimy when you get in there, for
Right.
sure. For
And
sure.
just to add to that about your guys talking about technology and how it's been evolving, you know, just to share some anecdotal experience, I service a lot of families in the Houston community. And that is actually the number one crime that occurs in school systems, where there's a cyberbullying, sexual assault, or
Mm-hmm.
sexual assault via the phone. And it makes me wonder how comorbid this can be to a child's, you know, depression, anxiety, or development, self-esteem. The list goes on and on, but it's huge impacts compared to when we were kids, how, you know, the phone has changed and the access of the internet. And then we talk about footprint, and there's a lot of litigation that can occur, but who's actually being represented with this litigation, you know, because lawyers are expensive, the
Mm-hmm.
stress of litigation, and then, you know, it just builds up. So I'm glad you guys are bringing up different points of how sexual assault has evolved a lot too, and
Mm-hmm.
how we need to cover each base and continue to advocate for it.
Absolutely. And your point, which is why it was so important for us to be diverse, when you're saying who can even afford the litigation. You know, there's certain communities, especially the communities that I serve, in Title I schools, and they're Title I because they are impoverished based on the family income. They can't sit around and wait for, oh, this happened to my child, so let me go get, you know, and then that can lead to something else because they still feel like somebody owing blood. You know what I mean? So that leads to so many other things for sure. It's definitely. I already see a part two. We only on round one. So we're going to go ahead and move on to round two. And round two is talking about consent. Consent. So before, I know I said I won't lead the rounds, but I do want to start off with the definition, like a blanket term definition, right? Because we're mental health professionals, so we're about to go every other way. But at the bare foundation of the word, it is to give permission for something to happen. That's the bare bones. To give permission for something to happen.
So I'm glad you talked about consent, because you defined it for us for both parties discussing this, you know, engaging in an activity that both parties agree. So, you know, the number one thing I always think of is, you know, sexual violence culture within universities, and alcohol and other variables that are being played into this giant formula we call a relationship with somebody, you know. And unfortunately, it's a real concept that we see in university culture, dating culture, and even at the bar scenes, going to the bar, anything that's social. So consent's very important, and I think it not only for both parties to understand what it is, but also respecting consent. Because man, so many men get triggered by it, or oh, this girl doesn't like me, man, f her, or something like that. And to see that, I was like, oh man, dude, you need some counseling yourself, bro. Like it impacts you. But for us as clinicians and having this multicultural background, consent is very important, but also the reaction of consent and when to protect yourself, because it's also being aware in a setting where you don't feel comfortable and stepping aside from that setting.
For sure. I wanted to chime in when you mentioned, there were two things you mentioned, but as soon as you mentioned the men getting triggered, heteronormativity,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just that assumption that you must be desired. And if you are not, then something's wrong with her, right? So how you just kind of went to the F her.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard that. So, you know, literally somebody cut me off in traffic and tried to kill me because I was like, oh, thank you. But even just outside of university culture, where that is very prevalent, I think back to my assault, which happened in a relationship with a boyfriend, you know, which there was already violence going on prior to, but it was also just that part of the heteronormativity. Well, they want it, so this has to happen, or you say no and they keep going, so you're kind of like, okay, I just wait. You know, like even that's confusing to a teen who has been through trauma and not having parents, and you know, and all those things that lead up to those factors. But one thing that's so important when we're talking about consent, right, is to give permission. Silence is not giving permission. And that is something that I just want to echo into the world, because a lot of times someone may succumb to, okay, your advances or anything, but that doesn't mean that they're comfortable. That doesn't mean that that was something that they want to do. That doesn't mean that they are saying yes. And that is so important. I see it so much even in elementary, where they're like forcing other friends to hold hands, or they walk up to me and I'm holding something and they're forcing, give me a hug. So I know that I'm trying to start very young of like, you need to ask. And then you hear them say, but I want. It's not about your wants. It's about what I feel comfortable with, and it's not to shame them or anything, but it's one of me and 700 kids in that school. So if all day, like that's a lot. That is a lot. So, yeah, just kind of mentioning the heteronormativity of, okay, I made my advance, she needs to take it, and even flipping that when men really don't want to engage in activities, but heteronormativity says, why not? Where's the space for them? How can they be vocal in their consent? So yeah, I want to put that in the space or to the discussion.
I just want to add, I think in our judicial system and just in our society norms, consent is kind of a gray area. And I think it should be black and white. And I think you just had a good definition for us. And silence does not mean consent. There's a book by Malcolm Gladwell, Talking to Strangers, where different states have different laws on what is consent. And some states feel if a woman removes her clothing, that's enough for consent, which some states, of course, do not agree. But I think just the term consent should be black and white. As you said, like silence does not mean consent. Me removing clothing does not mean consent. Me engaging in a physical act does not mean consent. I may want to kiss you, but not physical penetration. Yeah. So I think that's one area we need to like iron out. Consent is, I think it was perfect what you said. Silence does not mean consent. It needs to be confirmed.
Mm-hmm. Can you mention that book again?
Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you. Okay. Valerie, did you have anything that contribute to? She writing a book down too. Did you have anything?
It's interesting you guys are talking about like the university culture. So I was recently in a conversation with a young lady, and we were just talking about dating, and she described a date that when I heard it through like a clinician's point, I was like, no, that was assault, right? And she was very much like, well, I was uncomfortable and I felt bad, and I had to tell him like, but she didn't like, she was not connecting the pieces, and she was saying something like, well, I just think like we don't really have good chemistry. And I just had to be like, okay, like, hold on a second. I was like, what you described to me sounds like assault. And her eyes just went like this. Because I think right? Like the definitions of assault. And I think the thought that she was like, well, I went on this date. Like I agreed to do some stuff, right? Like,
Mhm.
but not this stuff. She could not like put it together. And so I was just thinking about how you were saying about teaching it young. So these are young adults that not necessarily have they been exposed to even like the word consent or like the concept. I mean, I think even like people my age, right? Um, and so I think it's so important the work that you're doing, especially with young kiddos, because 100% they're like, they think that they're just entitled to hugs or like, and yeah, you think like, okay, some of these kids probably don't get hugs ever,
Mhm.
right? I get that, but so important to learn that concept from the beginning young. Yeah.
Absolutely. And just to create space for that young lady's experience, because she's not the only one, right? And even in our society, that's normed. Well, you went on this date, well, you did this, well, you were willing to do that. And it's so common. And you guys, especially men, chime in, you know what I mean, and check me and, challenge me. But it is so common for people to look at the woman, to look at the woman as to what her acts were, right? I told, before we got on this call, I talked a lot about respectability politics, where present yourself respectable and do with this and this and this and this, and then it will prevent. And it's like, no, it won't. We're not talking about how not to be a predator. I don't hear those conversations. I don't, even growing up, I didn't hear, when this happens or somebody makes you feel this way, then you're unsafe. I didn't hear any of that. So then you navigate and then you're going through trauma, don't have parents, you get this guy who treats you like shit, you know what I mean? And then it leads to something else, but you're like, but we're in a relationship. Like even that was in my head, of knowing I'm not safe, but we're in a relationship. Um, so yeah, I wanted to have a moment for her and other people like her and other men. Men are sexually assaulted, and I feel like there's not enough light on that, and that they have to be, once they're uncomfortable, now I got to be hyper masculine, or I have to hide it, or I have to. No, I'm gonna just be single, bro. And it's like, no, you're just uncomfortable, you know. Yeah. So I just wanted to put that in the space. Anybody can piggyback off of that.
Well, I agree with your sentiment about for us the women not even being a second thought, not even being a primary to sexual assault or when it comes to consent. And I think for men, it's just a social norm that's only been amplified as we go forward, and it's just whether it's a law or not, things are accepted behavior wise from men, and it's just not fair, and it's just not right.
For sure.
Yeah, I want to add to Chester's comment that it definitely is a huge social norm that we see in our culture and a lot of cultures that are very hyper masculine. And me being Hispanic and coming from a Latin background, machismo is a very big concept. So when sexual assault does happen or sexual violence, it puts men in a very fight or flight stage that could even lead to even more chaos, whether it's, the police involved or anything like that. So I kind of just wanted to cite it. I wish I could show the video, but Terry Crew, the actor, talked about how a producer sexual assaulted him, and how it took you know, every part of his body not to react with anger. And that shows me how it impacts men, because men are ready to throw down and engage in this fight or flight, especially when you come from a culture that you had to be that your whole life. And with men, anger is such a huge component and reaction. And, it's just a big snowball effect where it can just lead to any worse consequences. So I think it is very vital for men to talk about it and for men to say, man, I was this close to kicking that guy's ass, but you know what? I controlled it. He was under the influence. You never know, but it can show you what it can prevent. And my biggest thing with a lot of multicultural backgrounds, I just want to share that, hey, like, you don't want to go to jail. Control your emotions, regulate your triggers, and prevent from any escalation from happening. But it is a teaching moment, not only for grown men, but for young adolescents that are becoming, young men, and teaching them, like, hey, anger is not a solution for any of this. And then I can see that with women too, how many women have internalized anger from, being victims of sexual assault. So I wanted to bring up the Me Too movement because that's something we've seen in this past decade, how it's really brought a voice to a lot of women. But I'm hoping that it would evolve for men too. So that's why I brought up this little clip about Terry Crew, because I think it's important for men to share this spotlight too, where, hey, you can't react with anger. You have to be more articulate and have a plan for it. But yeah, Chester, you hit the nail right on the head about this, and it's a very sensitive topic to talk about on the perspective of men.
And just one final word that I wanted to mention was, we're talking about cultural representation, right? And even a lot of these places that this is happening are under-resourced neighborhoods. And the people in those neighborhoods know that these people are vulnerable. When you think about the police, you think about church, you think about that community center, you think about that daycare. And that's something else too. So even having the conversations early about consent and what is unsafe, I think that can help some people, how we talked about in the last round, don't have access to support or don't have access to help. But at least it's not, this happened to me when I was 7 and I haven't told a soul until I'm 57, right? Like that's so important for sure. Okay, so I thank everybody for that was a very healthy conversation for round 2. So we're moving on to round 3, where we will be discussing the impact of sexual assault. We know that this can, I imagine that we have a lot to say. But yeah, so we're just going to talk about the impact of sexual assault. And one thing that I do want to include, because we were going to have Sarah on the call and she was not able to make it. And what I do want to just kind of put into space before we talk, Sarah works with the geriatric population, and a lot of times I'm sitting in and we're doing triadic supervision. And so just like hearing her clients' situations, almost all her clients had some trauma from childhood. And more than half of what I hear her share is there was some sexual trauma that was never discussed. So like even keeping that in mind, and her clients are 50, 60, 50 is young for her clients. So they're like 60, 70, they've been married for 48 years, things like that. And things, right? So all these decades of experience, they're still going back to when they experienced a sexual assault in their childhood. And her population is Hispanic, right? So a lot of them are from Spanish speaking countries, which is a cultural difference. So it's almost like you couldn't talk about it, or didn't exist, and they just went on their whole life trying to cope. And then now I'm at the end of my life still affected by this. So I did want to share that and put that in the space, because she did want to speak about, what she experiences with her clients. But so just talking about the impact, it's going to follow you for decades. Even if you do the healing and doing the work, it's still going to show up. So who would like to lead this round on the impact of sexual assault?
I was just going to say, that reminds me so much of intergenerational trauma. So when you're talking about people now in their end stage, and to think that, it's just an isolated incident that's only your burden is just, no, all the people that are your grandchildren, your children, I mean, the impacts that it has on family, and the fact that it's not discussed is just, it really is very impactful to the entire family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For sure. So I can add to what you shared, Valerie, because when you said that, what came to mind for me was the intrapersonal distrust and the interpersonal distrust. So where if my grandmother, great grandmother went through this, right, especially in our culture, in Black culture, great grandmas and Madeiras and all that, you were probably married off at 13 and 14. And you know what I mean? And you weren't talked about what this looks like and all these different things. And Now you don't trust yourself. Now you don't trust me. Now that is being bled over to how you said, Valerie. Now I'm raising my children in that. And my children, and you hear so often, especially when I see in clients of like, well, it's always been that way, or my mama used to, or and it's like, whoa, it's hard to be that person that says, okay, this is not okay, you know, or like I am going to go ahead and do something about this. Yes, Dorian.
Yeah, I love how you both of you guys talked about how generational it can be, and that's where I bring up a concept where like breaking the generation curse. You know, advocating for yourself and for the newer generation, for your nieces and nephews, your kids, and talking about these subjects, even though they can be hard. Because when I thought of that pretty much case study you shared with me about your colleague with geriatric clients dealing with trauma, it made me think of the book The Body Keeps Score, and how, you know, trauma builds up and it affects your relationships. You just talked about inter and intrapersonal relationships. That's going to be hard on people's development, and you can see it with your friends. The work environment. A lot of people in a geriatric age are still dealing with that internal conflict. So that's why it's important to not only seek help and advocate, like, hey, you can still get counseling services at your age. There's no judge. It's a judgment-free zone, but it shows me how important it is to break this generation curse and talk about it and educate. And not only with this sensitive concept of, you know, sexual violence, but also with suicide, with mental health, all these other concepts that are very sensitive and very deep. It has to be talked about instead of just brushed under the rug because, you know, my grandmother did it, my Thea did it, my and all that. And then that's where I go back to how the impact of sexual assault with generations is with a lot of the generations, especially patriarchal generations. It impacts where, oh, men can't do no wrong. He's a provider. He's feeding us. He's doing this. But, you know, everyone has skeleton in their closets and everybody has trauma. And I think it's important to bring up that trauma and establish those boundaries where like, hey, I don't want my child to be around uncle so-and-so, because a lot of this happens within families, which is it's bizarre to me, but it's so common. I wish I can show the statistic, but you know, in Hispanic communities, you see that left and right, and it's heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm. I had something I want to share, but I hadn't heard from Chester yet. So Chester, after you, I wanted to piggyback off something he mentioned.
Sure. One of the biggest things I've seen with impact is that awareness. A lot of individuals aren't aware of the impact it's had on them, their behavior, their life, short term and long term, and also like generational, right? So if I didn't know it's affecting me now, I go off and have kids and so on, and things they tend to just like a ripple effect. It just goes on and on and on. Because I'm unaware that I've had a trigger from an incident I faced with a Thea, uncle, or whatever in my past when I was in my youth. And I think that's one of the biggest I try to initiate with my clients in that area is awareness. Okay, where's the trigger? Where were you affected? How's it impacted you? What can we do going forward? So I think awareness is very big when it comes to impact, and also pain is real when it comes to impact. I think we tend to blow things off. Oh, you was young. Oh, well, as you said, that happens in every family. Our culture is accepted. No, pain is pain, and we need to acknowledge that going forward with impact.
Mm-hmm. Two things I want to piggyback off of now. When you mentioned that pain is real, I think sometimes what's missing is grieving. Like grieving that experience, no matter how late in life you are, how long ago it was, like there's a loss you experienced, whether it was your innocence, whether it was your trust. I think that is so important. And sometimes that helps with that self-awareness of, you know, and there's been several times that I had a client, I'm like, we're going to create space. You know, it's uncomfortable. But we're going to create space. Don't say anything. But we're going to create space for that. So it can now not be within you, but be in this space. I think that's really important. And Dorian, you mentioned something. I'm trying to use my counseling skills where you kind of can track. It's a little weak right now, but you mentioned something regarding family. And of course, that's very important. I think that affects all cultures, you know, not just the cultures represented on this call or with this panel. That affects a lot of us. But something that I wanted to add to that was sexual assault can happen within marriages. Sexual assault can happen within relationships. And I know I kind of spoke about that briefly of like me being in high school and only dating one person. And then, it happened to me. But I think that's so important because you hear the term duty sex with married couples of like, okay, well, he wants it and, or she wants it. And of course you may not be coerced into doing it, but again, that consent. Is it just, I'm just going in and performing and not really saying, yeah, this is what I want or don't want. And that's very common. And growing up on What's Love Got to Do with It, right? That was a very popular movie in my upbringing. And there was a moment of that in the movie. And I remember watching it with an aunt, and my aunt was like, yeah, that happened to me before. Right? Like just having a moment. I'm a kid, and she had a moment of seeing herself as something that happened with her partner that she had children with. And it's like, that's very common. That doesn't go away. No one is obligated. And that's part of the impact. It almost feels like it's an obligation of like, I have to do it, or I have to internalize how I really feel and not expressing myself. So yeah, I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
And thank you for sharing that, Bianca, because it's a tough discussion, right? To create space, and then seeing it with our family members that go through it, and say, man, what could you have done different if you can go back in time, So that's why I'm just advocating, just talk about these topics, especially when, kiddos are growing into their body, understanding what sex is, trying to learn about it, And it can be overwhelming, especially if you're not given these tools or these lackluster programs that public school give us. A lot of it starts with our families and re-innovating these conversations.
And to piggyback off what you just shared, when it talks about the impact of sexual assault, respectability politics will not save you. They will not prevent you or a predator from doing what they're going to do. I think that's really important. Again, like I said, we're not saying like, hey, how not to be a predator. You know what I mean? We're not having those conversations. Or when we are talking about women, like, oh, well, girl, you were married. Or, bro, that's your girlfriend. You get what I'm saying? Like, even hearing that and having nieces and nephews, and some of them are uncomfortable with hugging. But we're not creating the space to say, what makes you feel uncomfortable giving them a hug? Right? But you'll text them all day, but you'll do these things. So speaking about the impact, I think even just having those conversations to bring awareness, and how when Valerie mentioned in a previous round of initially when she heard someone's experience, she was like, hey, did you even know this? Did you know that this was within the lines of assault? Right? And that is eye-opening of like, oh snap, she lacked education, right? Because society says heteronormativity. No, you went on a date and you told him you do this, so right? And it's like, no, that's not what it is, for sure. Was there anything else anyone wanted to add before we move on to round 4?
I just wanted to add the thing about how it impacts families, and like the fact that you don't even know. So like in Hispanic culture, right? Like you can't spend the night at anybody's house, like never. I don't know. Like as a kid, I was never allowed to spend the night anywhere, and it was like because there's men in that house, but you don't. So now you think back and you're like, well, does that come from an experience that they had and I didn't know? And I was just like, hey, like, don't even ask me to spend the night at your house because I'm not allowed to.
Right.
So I think things like that, like you go through certain experiences later on in life and you are not really sure where they come from. But like now that I'm older, I'm like, okay, that's interesting. Like at the time, I'm just like, nope, like not allowed to spend the night at anybody's house.
For sure. That is, but we also have that background now of like challenging and thinking and what if, and this is underlying, and definitely has, I thought I lost you guys, definitely has changed how I approach common things. And still navigating that, right? Because we're newbies. You know what I mean? So we have this awareness, and probably for a lot of us, we're first generation healing. We're first generation of a lot of things from what we learned. But yeah, I appreciate that mention. So we're going to go on to round 4, which is seeking help for and advocating against sexual assault. So that can be, how are people to seek help? How can we as professionals support people in seeking help? Or how can we advocate, or how can they advocate for themselves? Or how can a loved one, you know what I mean, advocate or like, I'm aware that this happened. Because especially when it happens in families, somebody knew. That person's not sitting on that all themselves, but they went in isolation all those years because nobody else wanted to step up or call out or say, hey, maybe we need to stop inviting such and such to the family functions. And something that I would like to add or just kind of start the foundation of the conversation is keeping the other individuals in mind, such as disabled individuals, non-binary, and men. The topic is very prevalent around women. Mm-hmm. And again, the disabled, those having mental illnesses or mental conditions where people know it. You're very aware that this person is not neurotypical, you know, and so they're vulnerable. And then disabled, I kind of mentioned to you guys, you know, people who are in nursing homes, people who can't advocate, people who can't get up for themselves, people who are needing people to help them change diapers, right? You're so vulnerable. Like, it's literally like right there. And then men experience sexual assault, and society tells them that, you know what I mean? Kind of like what Valerie mentioned with her client. I was like, oh, no, maybe not. You know what I mean? It's like, no, it is what it is. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to put that into space. Of course, speak how you wanted to speak, but just keeping those other individuals in mind who are underrepresented on this topic.
I'm just kind of thinking like in the college setting, just those awareness campaigns, like it was just, some shocking for that young lady. And so I know like this month we did it was small, but we did some like just kind of facts and like resources out there. But I think like the young adults, like this is a good population to really have that awareness, because I really think it is just that education piece. Like they don't know, so many things have been normalized in society. So, you're thinking you're just going on a bad date. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the education part, I think it's a really good point though that you made about those other vulnerable populations. Because if I think about like just resources off the top of my head, right? For one, they're very like the women's center, things like that. And so it's not inclusive. And I'm drawing a blank to think like if I had a, similar to that, like where would I tell my male client? Mm-hmm. And that is so true. Like I'm having a hard time thinking like, where is there something like that specifically just for men to feel safe in their space to share their experiences? Mm-hmm.
I think you're dead on, Valerie. I can't think of any group resource for men or disabled this disabled individual that's not the female or particular gender that that doesn't have resources to say, okay, well, we can go here and share, or we can go here and feel included. I'm gonna think of like a one-on-one private practice session. That's about it. I can't think of anything, and that's unfortunate. Mm-hmm. Cause I think about like even for us, like the Me Too movement was mentioned by Dorian. We had Terry Crews and a few other men come forward, but if we just look at statistics, there's a lot more males out there that's impacted by this, that didn't feel safe or felt confused, didn't know how, or was not even aware of what the normalization of what sexual assault is and impact. So I think you're right with advocating for starting young, because we have classes for everything else. When I start a class to teach just individuals, regardless of gender, race, just individuals, mm-hmm. What is sexual assault and have awareness for it.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to, before Dorian jumps in, I did want to mention when you mentioned that Terry Crews and some other men came forward. Sorry, okay, that was weird. When Terry Crews and some other men came forward, the backlash they got. There was not a safe space. There was not people saying, yeah, that's it, be brave. There were celebrities publicly shaming and right that heteronormativity, like, man, bro, it was a woman. And it's like, what? My body, it's okay for my body to be violated and you condemn me for that? And that's a married man. with children, coming forth. It's not somebody like, oh, let me get some clout, let me get some, but he is very buff, masculine, you know what I mean? And the roles that he plays. And it's like, where's their safe space? So that's something else that came to mind. Dorian, would you like to share?
Yeah, well, I love that we're talking about where it's being neglected, where we need to put eyes on areas that are intersectionalities happening with, the disabled, with minority men. And the number one thing I kept thinking about right now, where everybody's talking about, is seeing it in pop culture right now. There's this wave with the Me Too, but even recently with that film about the Nickelodeon star children and how the impacts follow them, especially for one of the main individuals, Drake Bell, I think that was his name. He's just openly talking about self-disclosure and what happened to him. And I was like, man, I can't imagine, the courage and bravery and hurt that he has gone through, but for him to just talk about it. So to see that as a male, in my perspective, it's like, wow, celebrities are coming out, because it happens to the affluent. It can be classism too. Affluent rich people are going through this stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
And although this just focuses on childhood stardom, I think it just brings a reality that it's everywhere. It doesn't have to be in, family dynamics. It can be in work dynamics. It can be in even Hollywood. And we all know how corrupt Hollywood can be too. But just pop culture, how it's bringing more awareness. And it brought relief to me to see that a male is talking about it and how it impacted him with substance abuse, where it impacted him with isolation, because all that stuff follows you. It's a domino effect. So we definitely need to shed more light on different individuals to serve different populations. But right now, the pop culture movement is what's been standing out to me, because at least we're in the right direction, creating this space and teaching our kids, like, hey, like, look what happened. These star children thought they were safe, and they were not only sexually assaulted, but sexually abused with verbal words, whether it's to their identity, to their background, and it's hurtful, and that stuff follows you, man. It's tough. It's called Quiet on the Set. It's been real popular lately.
Okay.
But it just talks about the corruption with middle-aged white guys taking the role and not having protection for these younger kids that are half of them were minority and half of them didn't have a voice.
Mm-hmm.
So it just builds up on that. But it's been very popular. I recommend to watch. It's hard to watch, but it's very eye-opening.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And before closing out this round, I do want to, I'm so glad that we all kind of agreed and acknowledged that we don't really have resources for people who are not women. And I think that's very important in moving forward, really having a voice for the non-binary community, because that's a whole other feat with people not understanding, right? And sometimes if things don't fit in a box, or if it doesn't make sense to me, I can't connect. And it's like, yes, we can. They're human. How Chester said, let's just start with the individual. And I kind of wanted to talk more about that in the round 5. So I wanted to ask, did anybody else have any final thoughts on advocating and people seeking support?
I was just going to add that I think that's why it's really important to have representation. So like more male clinicians. So because there's not places built out, I think that that's super important. Like the representation, more diversity in our, field for these very reasons, right? Because there's not like a one-stop shop for that. So.
Absolutely. 100%. My eggs in that basket.
And also lobbying, like Houston, Texas is last place for mental health. So lobbying and having schools like, hey, get your crap together, re-innovate these programs and have more clinicians at school settings, especially for our public schools, because that's what's lacking funding. And it's all, trickles down to how many clinicians are represented to help out, or programs. So I want to get back to the politicians, like, hey, you guys need to evolve and re-innovate these programs, because then we have cases like Uvalde happen, that it just is a bigger circle of how mental health is not being addressed, especially for sexual violence. There's a lot of other umbrellas, but since this is our topic, I think it really needs to go back to re-innovating programs and re-innovating these type of discussions. And it's, we're in a new era.
I'm gonna save my tangent because I'm in the public schools. I'm gonna save it. I'm say, Chester, you don't even have to go. You want to really in. But I will say one thing to that point is these systems and these laws have to see the child. That's not what's seen. So when we're saying reinvent things like that, they're like, let's get everybody a security guard on every campus, but we don't have a budget, so cut the teachers. It's a really, really difficult time. But I saved my tangent. So we're going to go on to round 5, the final round before we have our closure. And it is on reluctancy to seek help. And just the topic of, and we kind of talked about it with the last round of just people not seeking help. And it was brought into the space by Valerie, where some people just lack the education and the knowledge. So they don't even know, right? She's just talking to Valerie like, yeah, I went on a date. But she's not knowing, like, no, you could have been coming for, I'm not okay. You know what I mean? And then just any discussion, what can be done? I know we talked about lobbying. We talked about just the awareness. Even us as mental health professionals, I feel like we charged ourselves with the task of like, we need to find some other resources. And if they're not there, then we need to come back to this drawing board and say, what do we do? And why is that so? But just the reluctancy to seek help. I actually have a question that I want to pose, but I want to hear from everybody else before I pose my question. But yeah, so anybody can start off.
I just think the biggest thing that stands out is stigma, and how it impacts people's perception with themselves and with their family dynamic. And then, me being Hispanic, multiculturalism, like, we're collectivistic. We're a unit, we're a community. So when there's, these kind of investigations, oh, Uncle so-and-so touched me inappropriately, that's gonna hurt this unit's the ability to comprehend this. But I think it's a reality, because evil exists in every fashion, whether it's family, community, environment, you're gonna see it. And that's where I think the stigma, we just need to break it, have these little ones, give them the voice to talk about this, where they do feel uncomfortable. It's like, okay. And that's where we put the adult lens on, the counselor lens on, and say, hey, what's going on? Let me backtrack and see what's going on. But I've seen a lot of sexual violence within community members, especially Hispanics, where it's happened, and they don't want to speak up because they're scared to ruin the family dynamics at the next party where alcohol is available and machismo is at its highest, and it's really unfortunate. But it goes back to breaking this generation curse and encouraging kids and adolescents and even young adults to just talk about it. Like, hey, what happened? What's going on? Like, we'll set boundaries. We won't invite that person ever to this house, and just build confidence too for those people that have been victims. And also giving them informed consent will let them know, like, hey, it might get a little hard before it gets a little bit better. Because that's what I think contributes to this reluctance. Like, oh, I don't want to think about it. Oh, I don't want to deal with it. But, if you don't deal with it now, the next generation is going to go through it again. And I've had clients where I had to, encourage them and build their confidence. Where like, hey, you're breaking this generation curse to improve your well-being, but to set boundaries for yourself and your future kids, and then your future kids of kids, So it's very, very hard to discuss in the Hispanic community. But it goes back to this, machismo, where we see it with men, and men can't do no wrong, and they're providers, and it pisses me off, because I'm the new generation where I can see it. I can see through the BS. I can see through these blinding norms, and we need to change it.
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off the machismo. So like, let's talk about Marianismo, right? So like, that's a huge barrier for this concept of virtuous women, pious women, subservient women in the Hispanic culture. Like, I think that very much plays into not reporting, not seeking help, because I'm going to bring shame to my family. I am now not pure. So it's just going to bring a lot of shame to my family. So the same thing, right? Like we're not going to talk about it. We're just gonna sweep it under the rug. But I think machismo and marianismo, like those two things keep the community just so unhealthy. Yeah.
I just want to add that I think a lot of reluctance comes to just the normalization of this normal. And if we're not sure what normal is, we just say, okay, it's normal. We just move on. And I think it's easy to find comfort in easy, right? The hard things are uncomfortable. Coming forward is uncomfortable. If I just say it happens and I can just move forward, unaware of triggers and impact, it's easy, right? Go on, trying to live my life the best I can. So I think the normalization of is causes reluctance, and also just it can be discouraging. It's easier to do it this way versus taking the hard road.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Something, and we don't have to discuss it, but something that I did want to present, and Valerie mentioned it with we need more inclusivity and we need more representation across cultures and intersections of our identities. And something that came up when I was coming up with the agenda was how can more women, men, and non-binary individuals feel safe to go to men, right? Like society has already put it's the man, and that's not always true. And we have two men on here, right, who are passionate about it and who are like, heck no. But it's how, and we don't have to discuss that here because there's no answer for it, but just if there was a way for men, women, and non-binary individuals to feel safe to go to men. Because especially if you were assaulted by a man, there can be some resistance there. Or I wasn't, and now I feel like I'm a man. Now I feel embarrassed to go to you because we're men. And I'm about to tell you what this woman did to me, without my consent. It's just so much that has been normed by society that where are the safe spaces? And men can be safe spaces. I have two on the call, right? That's like doing this whole thing to say, no, I got you. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to plant seeds of that, of just like, how can we get individuals safe with men, to bring about that healing on this topic. So yeah, I just wanted to contribute.
I was just saying, I think for us female clinicians, I think it's checking our biases. So I recently in supervision, I sat in a presentation from I think his practice is called, I can't, but he's a male clinician. Mm-hmm. And he talked about exactly that, like not a safe space, like men are not seen like that. And so like as female clinicians, when you're going into work with males, understanding what your experience is, like what you're bringing to the table. Because right, like if they have to have a very typical conversation with you, like they're about to tell you something and they're picking up on those biases. So like, I think that was really eye-opening for me because I think I even had to think about my own biases, what experiences I've had or family when I go into working with male clinicians. And I will tell you that initially when I went on this college and I was going to start practicing, with my license, I'm not gonna lie, I was like, I don't know if I want to see male clients. Like, I don't know, like that, maybe it's a little scary. That's not the case anymore. But I think it's those things, like for female clinicians, like we need to recognize what our biases are in that, like that we don't feel safe.
That self-awareness piece that they, preach throughout our entire education of just having that self-awareness of your prejudice, biases, and assumptions. Yeah, I appreciate you adding that to the discussion. So we're going to move to the closure piece. I want to say thank you to all of you and shout out to us for surviving our first virtual roundtable. It was a new experience for us all. So I want to thank you guys for your knowledge, your expertise, your vulnerability, your courage. You telling imposter syndrome to sit on down. Because all this was fruitful, and I hope that it edifies and that people can hear us, see us, and say, I resonate, or I can connect, or I can give this to somebody else who can connect, or, oh my goodness, I didn't even think of that. I want to hear more about that, or even seek help themselves. and say, hey, I watched this thing and they said I could talk about this, you know? So is there anything else that you all wanted to share to close out?
No social media, unfortunately, but I can be found at Kimberly Boyd Counseling Center.
So I'm in the process of becoming an LPC associate, so it's in the near future. So probably at our next panel, I'll share social media and where you guys can find me. But just give me a couple of weeks and I'll be there. But I'm more than happy to share my information and have these real conversations, because these were real and uncensored and unfiltered, but it's much needed. So thank you for having us, Bianca. And it really got my counselor lens going, so I appreciate it.
Yay. Okay, Valerie?
Yeah, private practice soon to come one day, right? Gotta finish clinical supervision, gotta take the test. But thank you, Bianca.
Oh, absolutely. And so for me, my website is bwhitakercounseling.com. My email is info@bwhitakercounseling.com. Instagram is @bwhitcounseling. But yeah, so I thank you guys so much. This will be the first of many. And yeah, thank you all.